because what's going to happen is that, okay, you built the government, right? So you have revenue and your expenses are about the same. And hopefully what you bill the government is more than what it costs to provide the service. You're going to show a profit, right, for the month. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have more cash in the bank, right? Your cash may have actually gone down even though you showed a profit because you're still waiting on payment. And so you have to be careful with accrual that when you're looking at accrual statements, you have to look at the income statement to see what's happening with profits, right? But you also need to look at the balance sheet to see what's happening with cash. Just because there's profit doesn't always mean there's more cash in the bank. So just something to be careful about. So as an organization gets larger and more complicated, all of this is going to have to start getting more sophisticated as well. When you start off, it may be very simple, but as you get more complicated, you're going to want to make sure that all of these things kind of keep pace with it. Because it can be very, very dangerous to not have financial systems that can keep up with what you're doing program-wise. Because that puts you at risk for fraud, it puts you at risk for not being able to comply with your funders, or just not being able to have good and reliable financial information. So, how many, okay, I think a lot of you raised your hands to say that you did have a budget. How many of you don't have a budget? 1, 2, 3? Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the budgeting process, and then we're going to do a quick 10-minute exercise where we're actually going to try and draft some budgets for those who don't have budgets here. Just as a quick little brainstorming exercise. You're not going to walk away today with a finished budget, unfortunately, but you'll be able to start thinking about it. So just in general, a budget is a plan for getting and spending money to reach specific goals by a certain time. Usually it's a 1-year period. How are you going to operate your program? That's usually the main goal in this 1 year. How are you going to do it? And it's useful for a lot of different things. For planning, right? Figuring out how are you going to do it, right? Where are you going to get the revenue? Where are you going to be spending things? How are you going to structure your program? And then it's helpful for figuring out if it's feasible, right? Because maybe you have these big ideas, but once you put it down in paper, you may realize that it's going to be really hard to do the way that you first imagined it. And it doesn't mean that you can't do it. It means that you're going to have to rethink how you do it. You may need to rethink the time period. So maybe it just takes longer to get to where you want it to go. And it can also lead to further strategic thinking. So that exercise of thinking through how you're going to do things may help you think of other opportunities, other threats that are going on. Budgets are also really important for management and monitoring. So making sure that you're sticking to plans and that your costs make sense, that you're not overspending, that you're getting revenue that you need. And it's also actually can be helpful for fundraising, right? So a lot of funding sources ask for a budget, you know. It may also be helpful if you have a shortfall. You know, you have what you're planned and you're missing a little bit. Sometimes having a budget can help you with fundraising. To be able to show people that you've thought through how you're going to do this, and these are the financial resources you need as a fundraising document.
What happens if you're just starting out with 501(c)(3), you really don't have a budget, and you're trying to get financing? What happens then?
You may want to do a projected budget, and with any kind of budgeting, you're never 100% sure about revenue, right? Even when for-profit companies do their budgets, right, they're never 100% sure what their sales are going to be. But with a startup, there may be even more uncertainty. And so there's different ways. You know, one way is you just do your best guess of what you think revenue is, or you may just do the expense side and see, like, this is what the expenses might look like, and maybe I think I can raise this much money this next year. Other times nonprofits will do scenario budgets, so they might have, you know, scenario A, if I get this much money, scenario B, if I get this much money. Or people also will have an opportunity budget, so they have a basic budget, which is what they're planning to do, and then maybe they apply for this grant that they're really, really hopeful about. They can't plan for it because they're not sure they're going to get it, but if they do get it, they have a plan for how they're going to spend the money. So there's ways around that, but you're never 100% certain. But it can be hard to like start off and not know where to get or how to go about it. So I just put a couple notes about the budgeting process. There's a piece of it that's kind of establishing. I forgot to say, this is going to look a lot simpler if you're just a startup, but this might be something you kind of want to follow these basic steps. One is to have timeline and responsibilities. At some point, the board needs to be involved. Usually it's helpful for the board to be involved at the beginning and the end to approve, and then kind of at the beginning to set parameters. And it's helpful for it to be an inclusive process. So this may not apply if you're a startup and there's just 2 of you, but if you're a larger organization, it's helpful for people who are in charge of stuff to have input. So for the fundraising person to give input on how many donations they think they can raise, or for the person who's in charge of running the daycare program to give the numbers for how much they think it's going to cost. The second step is to create the budget, and I make it sound really easy, but we're going to dig a little deeper into this. It's often iterative. So sometimes you draft a budget and you realize that you're short $50,000. So sometimes you have to redo it, right? Or you have to rethink things. Usually there needs to be a formal board approval at some point, and then it's helpful to communicate it to other people, either to your staff, if you have staff, or to other stakeholders to share what the budget is. And then it's important to monitor, right? Because you want to make sure you're keeping track of your budget. So the budget's usually entered into your accounting software. You can compare revenues, your actuals to your budget, and then you can revise your budget as needed. Do you have a question?
Stakeholders for a 501c3?
So it could be funders, board, could be anyone who might have a vested interest in the organization.
Oh, not necessarily a financial interest, just
Oh,
a,
yes.
a stakeholder could be somebody with just their
Yes,
heartstrings
yes,
attached
yes.
to it.
Congregation.
Congregation, yeah. You don't necessarily need to share with all those people, but you may want to think about who is it important to share the budget with. So, budgeting, I said this before, it's a type of planning, right? So it forces you to think about how am I going to do this. And then it's also helpful to think long term. I think the mistake that people make when they make budgets, they think, well, I got this much revenue, let's figure out how to spend all of it down, right? But we talked about how important it is to have savings, right? So sometimes you may want to spend all of it down. There may be a good reason for it. But there are other times where, if you have extra cash, you may want to think, well, I need to establish savings for future use. Or maybe there's some bigger investment I want to make 2 years from now that I want to start saving towards. So that's important. You don't have to have a 0 at the bottom for a surplus deficit. You can have a positive number. And then you should really be careful to ask yourself why if you have a negative number. Like, why are you running a deficit? Is there a good reason for it? And then there's really only kind of 3 main approaches to doing a budget, right? First one is called starting from scratch. So that's for the startups, right? When you have no idea what you're going to do and you have to draft your budget and figure out what you're going to do. The most common way that a lot of people will do is called prior year results, which you basically start with last year, how you did things last year, and then you kind of revise things based on what you think is going to change this year. If you think you're going to get more donations or less donations, if you think that salaries are going to grow by a certain %, so you kind of adjust your numbers. And then there's something called zero-based, which is very similar from starting from scratch. The basic idea is, you've been running a program for a couple of years, and you could just budget by saying, we're going to do the same things we did last year, things just might cost a little bit more or a little bit less. Zero-based actually forces you to start all over again and say, okay, blank slate, I'm going to draft my budget from scratch. If I had complete flexibility, how would I run my program? And it may be complete. And they'll do zero-based maybe once every 5 years or something to just make sure they're keeping up to speed with how they're running things.
It's my understanding, that if you correct me if I'm incorrect, that nonprofit organizations can only have 20% of the total receipts carried over to the following year if they're not allocated for specific areas.
I actually don't know. I don't know the
I
answer
think
to
that's
that. I'm
that's
not aware of anything like
a
that.
taxation thing that I looked up.
Okay.
Yeah, federal government, yeah.
Is that from as far as federal government or as
Yeah,
donor
that's from the
contributions?
federal government. I
Okay.
mean, federal government requirements.
Okay.
If they were, you can't, if whatever the total receipts are, if, like, you can still allocate certain amount towards whatever ministries or whatever that going forward, the
Okay.
budget's gonna be. But after that, there can't be more than 20% remaining.
Okay. Because that's a good point. So
If they're a larger organization,
Right.
smaller organizations.
I
Fine with that.
kind of, I know of what you're speaking, but it's that those numbers don't quite work like that. You can carry over an infinite amount.
Right, it just has to be allocated, right?
well, allocation and expenditure, two different things. You know, you can allocate it, I mean, you don't have to spend, in other words, if you have $1 billion in an organization, there's only an X percentage that can go to your general expenses. A certain part of it has to go to whatever program you're funding.
Right, that's what I'm.
But you can carry over as much as you can.
As long as it's allocated.
Right.
That's what I was saying.
So that actually gets to a good point, is that sometimes funders will have restrictions on
Right.
what kind of surplus you can have and so on.
Right.
You know, some government funding sources unfortunately actually don't really let you have much of a surplus, because they'll cut
That
funds
makes
for the
sense.
next year. Which I think is very unfortunate, but it does depend on the funding source. So that's something actually I should have mentioned for the budgeting, is that make sure that there aren't funder restrictions on how you can budget. But there's no, from like a legal perspective, there's no restriction on how much, you know, surplus you can have.
Right.
But there may be funder restrictions.
Correct.
Thanks for bringing that up. All right, questions? All right, so we're gonna talk a little bit about starting from scratch. As far as budgeting is concerned, I think the prior year sort of is pretty straightforward. So I'm gonna kind of walk through some of the ways that people might think about starting from scratch. So the first piece is kind of figuring out how the program's gonna operate, right? Are you gonna rent space? Are there gonna be volunteers? You know, what are you gonna ask, you know, when are you gonna do, how many after-school programs are you gonna do? Are you gonna be at one site? Are you gonna be at multiple sites? So figuring out the details about how you'd like to run the program. And then from there, you might have a projection for likely expenses. And sometimes it's helpful to break those costs between fixed and variable, right? So let's say that the after-school program example, right? You may have set fixed costs. So maybe you're gonna pay the teachers that run the after-school program. And no matter how many students come, it's gonna be kind of the same cost, right? And then you may have rent associated with the schools, that you have to rent their space to run the after-school program, although most likely you can get it for free, but you know, you may have rent. So those stay relatively the same. They would change if you expanded a lot, right? I will say that all costs are variable in the long term, but sometimes it's helpful to think for over this 1 year, this is gonna be relatively stay the same. And then you might have variable costs, which are gonna change depending on the number of students you have. So that could be like food or art supplies, so then you can say, well, if I'm operating in 5 schools and I have 200 kids, that's gonna cost a lot more than 5 schools and 100 kids. So you're gonna have variable costs. And a lot of times when you're estimating variable costs, you wanna take estimates of how many people you think you're gonna be serving, and how much that's gonna change. And then there's a research piece. So once you have all your likely expenses, you may need to actually call vendors to ask for prices, right? Or you may, sometimes it helps to talk to organizations that are similar to get an estimate of how much it costs to run their stuff. You may need to estimate quantities, how many kids you think are gonna come to this program. If there's a lot of uncertainty, you may wanna add a contingency in, or as I said earlier, you actually have a scenario budget. It says, this is a 100-kid scenario, this is a 200-kid scenario. And then you may want to project revenue, where you're going to be able to get your sources. And then if revenue falls short, you're going to have to revise how the program operates, right? Or you may just, and that could be in terms of how it's going to work. Maybe you just do 1 school instead of 5 schools, or it may be like a longer time horizon, right? So I'm going to get up to 5 schools, but it's going to take 2 or 3 years, and maybe we'll start with 1 place only. So I'm just going to look at the clock very quickly. So let's just spend 10 minutes. I actually have some budget worksheets. And who were the 3 people here who didn't have a budget? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so this table can be split in half, and then I guess all of you, or is anyone here who wants to kind of talk about their budget and kind of work through it at all, in addition to the 3 that don't? Okay, so we'll have 2 at that table, and then we can just do 1 table here if you want, unless someone else wants to. So you don't have to fill this sheet out at all, but I have a sample budget worksheet, and it's really, really basic. Right?
Is this your exhibits or?
No, I actually have it.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I decided to do this after I
it's
sent
okay.
you.
I didn't know, because we sent the exhibits around, some may not have it if they came in a little later, the exhibit sheets.
So it's basic. There's revenue sources up top, expenses, and then your surplus deficit. So what I'd like people to do here who don't have budgets, I don't expect you guys to be able to fill this out, but maybe talk about how you're thinking about running your program, how you think about doing it, and maybe talk about what the expenses might look like, right, with your groups, and then maybe talk about where you might be able to get revenue for it. So you're gonna start brainstorming towards a budget. And most likely, you're not gonna be able to fill out any kinds of numbers, but you might be able to think, what are your fixed costs, right? What are the kind of big startup costs? And where might you be able to figure out how much it's gonna cost, right? What are some places you can ask, places where you can get estimates? And then for revenue sources, you may wanna think about where you might be able to get revenue, or if you have existing revenue sources, you may be able to write those down. So you can kind of start that budgeting. We only have 10 minutes, so just kind of start chatting about it. It's okay if you don't write anything down. And I really only have one copy per group.
No, we're doing
I know I didn't give you guys enough time to solve all the world's problems, unfortunately. But I'm sure you guys made progress.
Yes. Got all
All
my
right.
expenses, we don't have any income.
So what are 7,500?
Negative girls over here, tell them you're.
So it's $75 per trunk. So what are, alright, sorry, we need to come back.
I'll show you the whole thing.
I know you could spend a whole day talking about your budget. I just want to see someone said you have all the expenses but no revenue. Any other kind of big things that jumped out? It's probably the biggest thing.
Insurance.
Insurance? Can be expensive depending on what you're doing. Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, a lot of doing the budget is about figuring out how you're going to do something, right? Right. The numbers and getting the numbers down on a sheet of paper. It's a little bit of research, a little bit of Excel maybe, or paperwork. But the really hard part is actually figuring out how you're going to do it. And unfortunately, there's no easy solution for the revenue piece. I wish I could tell you, like, just open up this Excel spreadsheet and, you know, type a few things in and you'll get your revenue sources. So did you, for those of you who had trouble on the revenue side, did you have a chance to kind of brainstorm possible revenue sources, or was it at a loss, or what?
We were talking,
Go ahead.
we were talking about a couple different things, you know, fees for service,
Yeah.
donation pledges, rentals and grant, but then we also talking about how we taking, you know, different equipment that might have a depreciation value, like office equipment and, pickup trucks. We have an asset, but it's also taken down inside the, expense side. So, there's a couple number of different things that we were speaking about.
Okay. Go ahead.
One thing I might really recommend, and I did this in the corporate world, but in the nonprofit world it's very similar, is go to organizations that are already doing this and sit with them for a day or two and sit with their accountants and see how they do it. Because, you know, none of this is like, you know, I mean, I like everybody to believe this is brand new,
Yeah.
but, you know,
Right.
there's 1.5 million nonprofits in the world.
You know people who are doing something similar
Right.
in Philly or somewhere else, a lot of times people are really open to sharing.
They are, yeah.
Did any of you have any luck thinking about the revenue side? That's a challenge?
Well,
Yeah.
no, mine's real obvious, because we're starting a bottled water franchise and we're giving 100% of the profits to people without bottled water. Our revenue is when we start selling bottles.
Okay.
The problem is, we're spending a lot of money before we get that
Yeah.
bottled water.
Yeah, right. So it sounds like for you, it's almost, you may even want to need to go more detailed than that, right? So you need to find the startup money, but you also need to figure out how much bottled water you're going to have to sell before you can cover the ongoing costs and the startup costs, right?
This would get a whole lot easier if you could give me $400,000 right now.
Yeah.
Real easy.
But you know, a lot of people who want to start businesses like that, they're going to kind of draft out the business plan, right? They're
And,
gonna,
and that's,
then
there's
they
an
can-
organization that does that. They say nonprofits need a business plan also.
yeah.
Yeah.
And you obviously have to pay for the service. But there are organizations that work with nonprofits to craft a business plan. That's really what this is.
Marketing plan, business plan.
What organization are you talking about?
You have to go on Google it,
Temple
but,
Small Business Development Center.
Yeah, and University of Penn
Temple
also.
does it.
It's
I
free.
think the Enterprise Center also does stuff.
Right.
University of Penn.
But I think because you're looking at like a business model, with a good business plan and maybe a little bit of startup funds, you may be able to get a loan from a bank potentially,
Yeah.
right?
I
Or,
doubt that. It's more like looking at a grant.
well, some,
Because a bank's gonna want, you know, looking at your ability to repay, and you're not gonna have it for at least, 2.5 years.
That's right.
And they're not gonna fund that.
The problem with
Banks don't
getting a
typically
grant
fund
is,
startups.
we've got a 501c3 that gives away the money, but the water company has to be an LLC, and they can't take a grant from a
Right.
nonprofit.
But you can have the nonprofit own the LLC, right? So the grant can go to the nonprofit, and so they're legal, I mean, you have to talk to a lawyer about how to structure it, but there are ways around that,
Yeah,
so,
yeah, that's what we're working on.
okay. Any thoughts on your side on how? Any thoughts on revenue for your business, or is it?
No, we was like brainstorming a little bit, three of us at one time, of how to go about doing it, getting some seed money, or, and we haven't really come up with really anything concrete yet.
Yeah, so there are some sources for startup grants, and then a lot of it, I mean, a lot of nonprofits start off first volunteer, they start off small and then over time, because sometimes grant sources, I mean, there's some startup grant sources, but a lot of times people want a nonprofit that's been around for a while before they'll give this, more money. So a lot of times nonprofits, they're not able to do everything that they want at first. They start off small and then they build on it.
So we've been like writing letters, and we're
Yeah.
in the process of critiquing that now to try to get some seed money.
Yeah,
from different
that's
places,
great.
that's in the government.
Yeah.
But that was a good idea, what you were saying, like, instead of inventing the wheel over, there's a lot of people that's out there
Yeah.
doing that, dealing with returned citizens, and see what they're doing and
Yeah.
how they look, how it really looks.
And
Because
how-
sometimes we don't see how it looks, totally, especially on that side.
Right. And how they started up too, how they got their feet on the ground. You gonna say something? Oh, I think were you gonna
Oh,
say
yeah,
something?
I was gonna ask, what about, depends on what your organization is, if you get people to buy into, like, having informational things where you get someone to be a perpetual, donator every month, something like that, for a year, you put a blanket time on there for how long a donation will come in, and you just go.
It's hard to get a large base though when you're starting up. I mean, unless you're connected with a church, sometimes that's a good place to get connected.
The one thing I wanted to talk about, because everybody's here, they had the same problem in terms of revenue. When I first started my nonprofit, that was the main concern, was how will we get money to start up what we're trying to start up? And when I did this budget that I gave to her, one of the main things a lot of people asked me was, well, have you ever thought about contracting? Because we all have this thing about, we have to just do what we do, so how are we gonna get money to do what we do? And then I stepped back and said, well, why don't I try to see if I can get a contract with someone in terms of what we do, so that could bring in income. So what happened was, I actually got a contract with a known big corporation to do work for people that they couldn't do the work for within their company. So it was working with returning citizens who was in their program, who they didn't have specialized people who had the skill or training for. So that contract came to me. I went to their facility 2 days a week, made $3,000 a week to put back into my nonprofit. So it can be something that you don't think about, okay, how can we just do this and get grants or in pledges, because sometimes it really doesn't really just come like that. So how can you sell your services? Everybody has people within your nonprofits that they have special skill sets, gifts and talents that you can utilize and say, well, let me see, the government, this is a government agency, so we actually proposed to this government agency what we could do, and they were like, we don't have anybody in here that does that. So we actually went to the Pennsylvania Parole Board, and we actually started getting their clients, and they started to pay us. And that's what you do, you kick down the door, because that's the way you're gonna have to get money. You're gonna have to think of something outside of the box to get money for what you wanna do. It's, government contracts are out there. There are agency to agency, business to business contracts, individuals. People come to me and ask me to write I don't do business plans, they're 501c3s. And I will only charge them $300, but I really say, why don't you just sit down and take the time and read it and answer, because it's your heart, it's your passion, it's your mission. This is what you want to do.